Hello, today our topic gonna be a sacrifice on f2 and I hope you're gonna enjoy it. We will start with a great example of Bobby Fischer who played against Byrne with black pieces. So let's start with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, g3, c6, bishop g2, d5. We're in Grunfeld line. C takes d5, c takes d5, knight c3. Bishop g7, e3, castle, knight ge2. So we can see that nothing much happened. Knight c6, castle, b6. White played b3 and bishop a6. It's very difficult in this position to suggest any plan for either side. Bishop a6 comes to pin the rook on f1, so bishop a3 does the same. Rook e8, queen d2. Here you might think that e6 leads to a drawish position, but what about e5? A great move. After d-e5, knight e5, we can see how weak the d3 square is. The bishop attacks on d3, the knight attacks on d3, and the rooks will come on open files. Rook fd1. We should take a moment on this position. This is exactly the case of wrong move. You might think, what is wrong with this move? Why rook fd1 and why not rook ad1? Rook fd1 has its benefits. It goes out from the pin and it pushes the d5 pawn, so why not, yeah? But can you understand that there is a little weakness on f2? The f1 rook leaves the f2 pawn. Knight d3. Queen c2, a very logical move. White wants now rook d3, so black has to take care of it. What can be the move here? Can you guess it? Take your time. Pause the video. Alright, let me tell you. A brilliant knight f2, the key move of the position. King f2, knight g4. So if the king goes now to f1, there is a fork on e3. Knight attacks to c2 queen, and the king on f1. If the king goes to e1, black takes the e3 pawn with double attack. So white went king g1, knight e3, queen d2. Now, what was Fischer thinking here? It's really brilliant. After knight g2, king g2, he could see that these knights are very badly placed and the king is in a big danger. After d4, we can see that knight cannot go on a4 or any other square because the other knight is hanging on e2. So after knight d4, bishop goes back to long diagonal, bishop b7, king f1. Why not king g1? There is a trick. Bishop d4, queen d4, rook e1 wins the queen. What about king f2, queen d7, a very strong move, comes to h3, and the rook comes to d8, where the knight on d4 is very weak and the king is in danger. So white played king f1, queen d7, and white resigned here. Why? What about queen f2, right? Queen h3, king g1, and what is the problem now? The g2 square. After rook e1, white cannot take queen e1 because there is a mate on g2, and if rook takes e1, bishop d4, pinning the queen and threatening to mate on g2. So I hoped you liked it. Let's go to another example of Cifuentes Paradas Zviagintsov game. Sorry for mispronouncing the surnames. So white played here bishop g2. What is white's problem here? We can see that these pieces, they stand a bit awkwardly. Knight f2, king f2, rook e3. A very spectacular. If king takes e3, after knight g4, king d2, knight h6, black has perfect position. They are exchanged down, but white king is so weak and we have two bishops and dark squared bishop. Black is doing totally great. So after bishop e3, knight g4, king f3, black takes the pawn, and a brilliant move here. I liked this move so much. Queen e6. The king is pinned. The queen comes to attack the bishop on e3. So bishop f4. Rook e8. A very mysterious move. Why would rook e8? What it plans? First of all, the problem of bishop d5 was rook d5, queen d5, queen e4. So now we can see that rook e8 controls the e4 square and also threatens queen e3. White defended d5 pawn, and after queen e3, bishop e3, rook e3, king g4, black gave a very beautiful mate. King g5, h6, king h6, and rook e5. And white cannot defend rook h5 and bishop f8 at the same time. Let's go to another example, and this time it is my game against a very strong Icelandic IM, Gretarsson. So I was playing black pieces. It was Slav variation. Knight c3, d c4, a4, bishop f5, knight e5, one of the most complicated line, knight b d7, knight c4, queen c7, a very big line, g3 e5, this is all theory, bishop g2, and I chose to play g5. Of course there is another move f6, which is totally okay for black. So knight e3, one of the main continuation, g takes f4, knight takes f5, castle, queen c2, knight c5, castle. We take on g3 and a5. My opponent started to think a lot here, and he decided to come rook b1. Well, rook f d1, rook a d1 are the normal moves again. But rook b1 basically wants to attack me on b4. So knight e6, controlling b4 square, queen e4, and h5. This is very interesting position. White tries to attack on queen side, black tries to attack on king side. So who's going to be first? Rook fc1, rook comes on c5, bishop c5. Now we can see that bishop is very strong on this diagonal, attacks the f2 pawn at some point, and the queen on c7 is mysteriously standing, because after knight jump the g3 pawn can be a bit weak. b4, a b4, knight a2. So if white is in time to take on b4 and then attack me on c6 and b7 pawns, then I'll be in trouble. h4, time to attack. Knight h4. My opponent accepted the sacrifice. So what's going to be next? Of course, bishop f2. White has to take the bishop on f2 and rook d4. Now white's big problem is after queen f5, knight g4, king g1, queen g3, and black has decisive attack. So if queen c2, it's the same, queen g3. So white decided to give up the queen, knight d4, bishop h3, king b8, knight b4, and king a7. Eventually I won the game without any problems. Let's go to next example. So this is a very good example how Taimanov played. We can see that the bishop on b6 is very good, attacking the e3 pawn, f2, and the knight stands very good on g4. So it's time to sacrifice. Bishop f3 was played in the game, and knight f2. So queen f2 is obviously bad because of bishop e3, king f2, and here we have the star move. You might think, why not bishop e3, or why not queen e3? The king goes on g2 and he feels totally safe on that square. So what to do? Control the g2 square. Queen h3 controls the g2 square and threatens bishop e3. So now white is in trouble. Rook d4, queen h2, bishop g2, rook e3. Again a brilliant sacrifice, threatening on g3 pawn. So if white takes king e3, queen g3, sorry, king d2, bishop d4, we can see that black has totally perfect position after rook e1, queen g2, king c1, queen f3. They have two bishops and several pawns. So white played knight d5, queen g3, king g1, rook e1, rook e1, queen e1, king h2, and cd. They easily won. The rook is hanging, the queen is under attack, and the king is still very weak. Let's go to another example and see a very beautiful game of Carlsbad system. So we quickly go through the opening. Rook b1, white plans b4, b5, a4 to attack these pawns. So a5, rook fc1, h6, bishop f4, knight h5. Black borders the bishop on f4, bishop e5, bishop g4. Now where the knight goes? To d2. Bishop d6, bishop d6, queen d6, knight a4. White starts his typical plan to play on queen side on these weak squares, but they don't think about that the bishop on g4 and the knight on h5 is somehow dangerously placed against the king. So knight g6, queen c5, queen f6, knight b6, rook d8, queen a5. White grabbed the pawn and he feels totally happy. But what happens after knight h4? Now we see that the queen is on another side of the board. The knight is also on b6, does not help white's king at all. So white went bishop f1, queen g5, king h1, going from any attack on f3, knight f6, g3, knight f3, bishop g2, queen h5, threatening the mate. So white is forced to take, queen e1, rook d6, rook comes into attack, king g1, bishop takes g2, king takes g2, knight g4. Now we see that all black pieces are in attack. h2 pawn is threatened, and these pawns are very vulnerable. h3, knight f2, queen f2, rook f6, queen g1, queen e2, king h1, rook f2, with a brilliant attack. We can see that on knight f2, king f2 was not good. After rook f6, king g1, queen takes h3, rook c2 doesn't help because rook comes to f3, rook g2 and rook e3 with a decisive attack. Hope you enjoyed the part 1. See you soon in part 2.